Many acrylic painters know this frustration. You mix the colour perfectly on your palette, then apply it to your canvas, and then it dries, and then suddenly it's too dark. But I've cracked the code on exactly how much lighter that you need to paint it by using this system, which I'm going to demonstrate with this painting here that's inspired by the South Island of New Zealand. I'll also give you some general landscape painting tips for painting with acrylics. So one of the first things that's going to make the paint drying darker issue easier is to paint on a white surface. Now I know some people like to paint on a toned surface, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't do this, but if you're struggling with this right now, start by painting on a white surface until you get more used to working with your colours. Also, your colours will look cleaner as well. Now the next main thing is to start by painting the dark values and shadows first. So here the darkest darks are in the foreground, and for this I've used a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and alizarin crimson. Now as those shadows go into the distance, they're going to be getting lighter, and I'm still using the same colour mix but mixing in more titanium white and making it more blue, as the distant mountains tend to have a blue cast to them. But the other thing is I'm painting these distant shadows a lot lighter, because one of the things I'll be doing later on is restating the dark values and shadows in the landscape. Now just a quick rule about values. Values is how light or dark your subject is, and we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. But then as your landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So as I said, I've kept those distant shadows in the mountains and in the snow on the top of the mountains, I've kept it lighter, so that when it comes to painting the distant vegetation that's growing on the lower part of the mountains, it makes it a lot easier to not only get the saturation of the colour correct, but also the value as well. So for those distant mountains, I was using some really desaturated colours. Also, because I'd used lighter colours in the shadows, I'm more likely to make those distant mountains a little bit lighter as well. And then later on, when I restate those darks, I'll be able to really emphasise the shadows and compensate for the fact that the acrylic paint dries darker. So the first thing to do here to compensate for the fact that your paints dry darker is to paint the dark values and shadows first, and this will make everything so much easier for you to paint the areas in light. So I'll be showing you later on in the painting how we can further continue to counteract the problem of the paints drying darker. And in the meantime, I'll show you the other things that I'm doing in this landscape painting here. So one of the things I did was change the composition just a little bit. If you look at the reference photo here, the river was kind of on the edge of the photo, so I wanted to make that more of a feature in the scene, and I totally changed the shape of the river here. So the river is leading the eye into the composition, and this is known as an S composition or a compound curve. So the S composition is probably one of the most simple ones you can use, and it's really good because it just leads your eye into the scene and it makes for a much more engaging painting. Now, just to talk about some of the general colours that I've been using here, the landscape is pretty dry. I took this photo at the end of winter, early spring, and the landscape was looking quite barren. There's a lot of mountain grass there, so I've been using low chroma colours, chroma being another word for saturation. I use combinations of yellow ochre, titanium white, ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson. I did this to get some of these straw coloured tones in the grass that are very pale. And then I also added some green in there by mixing in some more ultramarine blue, yellow ochre and even a little bit of phthalo green. For the water, the river in the foreground, I used combinations of ultramarine blue, phthalo green, titanium white and yellow ochre. Now, one of the things I'm doing with my acrylic paintings is I'm using loose gestural brushwork. I mainly paint with oils, and my oil paintings are a little bit more detailed, but I've just recently been experimenting with acrylic painting, and due to the fact that they behave differently to oils, I decided to focus more on brushwork, especially loose impressionistic brushwork, getting life and vitality in your painting, but also colour and tone, which is really, really important. At this stage, I'm generally using number 5 Shiraz flat brushes. These are a synthetic brush that are made by Rosemary & Co, which are ideal for acrylic painting, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. So I've been using loose gestural brush marks. I've painted the snow on the mountains, but I haven't used pure titanium white. In fact, I've darkened the mixture by adding in a little ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and alizarin crimson so that it dries darker, and then I can add my lightest lights later on in the painting. So the thing to do is to keep your painting darker anyway, and then build up lighter layers of paint and save your lightest values until the end of the painting. Next, I was painting the sky here, and I was using ultramarine blue with titanium white and a little bit of phthalo green. I keep in mind obviously that it dries quickly, so I'm just going for more gestural loose brush marks here so that you can purposely see the brush marks that's in the sky. I'm trying to get this panel covered as quickly as possible, and then I can begin adding a little bit of detail. Now I'm painting on a 12" by 12" wooden panel here, and I've actually found that wood and painting with acrylic is actually a lot nicer than canvas, in my opinion. I haven't really liked painting on canvas that much with acrylics, but I'm finding these wooden panels really nice to paint on, but that's just my personal preference. So now that the panel is covered, we've got a good framework to work with in terms of the colours and tones in the scene. Now generally the lighter colours here aren't drying so dark, and now it's going to make it easier for us to start restating some of these dark values and adding some of these darker elements in the scene. Also being able to gauge how dark to make your mixtures. So with these darks in general, when we mix them, we are going to need to make them a little bit lighter, unless of course it's the darks in the very foreground, but just to compensate for the fact that they are going to dry darker. But another thing to think about is the elements in the landscape itself, as there are some rules here. For example, skies are usually some of the lightest values in the landscape, along with the ground planes of the grass, and this is something that John Carlson talked about in his book Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, which I can definitely recommend. So this is something to think about as well when it comes to values. Now, values really are much more important than colour mixing, and I heard a saying that values do all the heavy lifting, whereas colours get all the glory, and I think this is so true. If you get your values correct, then your painting's going to look good and it's going to have depth and distance. And you can get away with perhaps not mixing the right colours, so long as your values are working. But if your values aren't working, then your painting's probably likely going to be a disaster, or it could look very flat. So what I've been doing now is just adding more of these darker elements. The slanting planes of the mountains are getting darker in value, and you can see that in the scene here. Those distant trees, for example, that are growing on the side of the mountains, there's lots of beech forest there, are going to be darker in value, but as they're going into the distance, they're getting lighter. Now the darkest values in the landscape are the trees, and that's often because they're naturally dark in foliage and often have occlusion shadows when they're growing together. So this is something I was thinking about. Now at this stage of the painting, I was working on the river. Now the river in the reference photo, there wasn't really a lot of detail in it, and the water was transparent and pretty slow moving. So instead I decided to not add too much detail in the river, but instead just focus on brushwork. Now if you've been struggling with creating depth and distance and struggling with colour mixing, tone and composition in your landscape paintings, then let me help you. I understand your frustrations. So I'm giving away a free landscape painting blueprint, which is going to show you my proven system for painting landscapes so you can get repeatable results every time. It's totally free. Just click the link in the description box below and I'll send it over to you. Enjoy. Now then, back to the painting, and I was having a little bit of difficulty with the river there. I wasn't really liking the edges that I'd painted as I was trying to copy the photo, probably a bit too much. And in the end I just decided, nah, let's just carry on focusing on just the colours in the water and brush texture. The one thing about painting artworks that are more impressionistic is you don't have to have loads of detail, but you can still communicate realism by having a good composition and really focusing on those tonal values and correct colour mixes. Often our brains will make up the rest of the information, so even impressionistic paintings, when you look at them from a distance, can still look really realistic. So as I say, I just love focusing on brushwork, loose brushwork and impressionism with my acrylic paintings. As I say, my oil paintings are much more detailed, and you can see that in some of the other videos on this YouTube channel. Now here's the next part. So as I say at the beginning, we started off lighter with those distant shadows, also compensating for the fact that they were going to dry darker. But it means now, after the other areas that I've painted, such as the woodlands and forests that are growing on the side of the mountains, I can now make some bold statements with the shadow areas in these brush marks. So starting to paint the mountains here, the mountain shadows, those exposed rocky faces, and using a slightly darker paint mix, and again compensating for the fact that it will dry a little darker. But because we've got those other tones in the scene that we'd established even from the beginning, it's going to make it a lot easier to create those paint mixes. I'm also using the same colours that I was using earlier on. And now I'm starting to add more detail in the various elements of the scene, so tidying up some of these areas in the midground here. I also wanted to make the floodplain where the river is a little bit more interesting, so I started to just add the suggestion of bits of detail. There could be washed up old logs or stones and just plant debris in general. It's just going to add more vitality and interest to the painting, make it look more dynamic and impressionistic. Now to recap on what we did with the values. So I started off with my shadows first. This is super important. And even the lighter shadows in the distance. So if you remember, the shadows are going to be getting lighter. But overall I kept my colour mixes lighter in general to compensate the fact that they're going to dry darker. But also knowing that I'm going to restate the dark values later on in the painting and probably go a little darker than I did in the initial stages. So this is one of the ways that you can compensate for the fact that your paints are going to dry darker. It also depends on the colour that you use, but I've found that the darker darks that you paint, especially if you're using colours such as ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, these are definitely going to dry darker, so something to keep in mind. Now at this point in the painting I was definitely getting closer to finishing it, so I was just adding a bit more texture in the water here. Another thing that I did with the mountains was I painted the highlights in the snow, and this is where I used my lightest lights, which was titanium white mixed with a little bit of yellow ochre. So you want to save your lightest lights more towards the end of your painting. And there was just other little things to do, like restating some more of these shadows. Now there was one last thing with this painting. I thought I'd finished it, but then there was something in the composition that was just really annoying me, and it was that sandbar that's in the foreground. I felt that it was a little bit too long and a little bit distracting, so I decided in the end to just remove part of it just to improve the composition. But with that, the painting was complete. So I hope you enjoyed this painting demonstration. If you'd like a proven system for improving your landscape paintings, then don't forget to get my free landscape painting blueprint. Also, check out this painting, which is for sale on my website, along with other paintings and prints that I have available. I've put a link in the description box below. If you'd like to learn more about landscape painting in acrylics, then check out this video here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.